Okay, hi, this is Professor TOVANCHE. Today we're going to be talking about Black revolutionaries as part of our African American history course. So, by the 1750s, the English colonies are thriving up and down the seaboard, right? They're pretty well settled and they're filling up. There are better conditions now for ordinary white folk in the colonies. The servants by mid 1700s are now getting the rights of Englishmen. They're getting the land, they're getting more rights. And so you still see white servants coming over, but the percentage of white workers will just decline considerably compared to the number of slaves that will be forced to do that work. Now, indentured servants, they're still coming over, but there are fewer and fewer. And a lot of that has to do really with wars in Europe. War, of course, can hinder travel. At this time, the only way to travel, of course, was over the ocean on a boat. So a lot of these wars are fought on the high seas, and so it can be dangerous to get out there. So that hinders immigration from England. And of course, wars mean that wars need men, and therefore they start rounding up men to fight in their battles with them. Point is, fewer and fewer indentured servants are coming. And in fact, in certain areas, white people are outnumbered by black folk, especially the deep south, right? So Carolina and Georgia, they have huge numbers of slaves. And many owners are still largely absent, especially in the plantations in the interior. Point is that by 1750, slavery is well entrenched in the 13 colonies. The number of African slaves in the 13 English colonies continues to grow, not just from the transatlantic trade, but also from natural increase. There will be a point at which a lot of slave owners realize that slaves are in fact reproducing naturally. So the transatlantic slave trade is going to become less important to a lot of these folks. Not to say that it goes away, but if you don't need to buy new slaves, then you're not going to do that because you have so many slaves now that they're reproducing on their own. And this is a process that pretty much reaches its peak right around 1800 or so. So we're not quite there yet, but the point is more and more slaves are reproducing naturally. And what we're seeing across the colonies is that, black people in the colonies, they're going to exhibit a variety of cultural characteristics. We have to remember this is they're sort of an admixture of cultures and colors. We see a variety of African newcomers who, who come with different ways of thinking, different languages, different cultures, different religions. We see also Caribbean-born slaves being brought to the 13 English colonies. These are going to, have some Spanish background, some French background, at least in language. And of course, even within the colonies themselves, because depending on whether you live in New England as a slave or you live in Carolina, for example, as a slave, you're going to live a different life. And in fact, as we've noted, Black Northerners are much more English than those in the South. Even if they're slaves, they're working on family farms or they're working in cities. Now, that means that they are not as restricted as their southern counterparts. In fact, in a lot of northern areas, cities in particular, and by the way, this also happens in some southern cities, right? But it's the urban environment where they're away from the plantation, right? And this, of course, happens more in the north, but it also happens, as I said, in some southern cities, where this actual process of hiring out becomes popular in a sense. Hiring out, that just means, imagine I'm a slave, right? And I am owned by this guy over here. Well, this guy over here doesn't need me to work all day. He just doesn't have that kind of business, right? I might be helping him in his blacksmith shop. Well, he might hire me out to the wagon wheel fixer down the road, right? Now, this means that, well, it can be beneficial to all parties involved. Now, of course, we have to be careful with that sort of language because slavery is not beneficial to the slave. However, even a slave, under the conditions that he lives in here, can get a little bit something more than would ordinarily be expected. So what do I mean? So let's look first of all at how hiring out works to the benefit of the slave owner. Now, if I am hired out to the artisan down the road. Well, I'm going to make a small bit of money, but my master is going to get a piece of it. So the slave owner, the guy who actually owns me, he gets a little piece of it. So he makes something out of this. He's not going to let me go and just do my own thing because I want to. The person who rents me out, that person will also get something out of it. What does he get? He gets cheap labor. A lot of these folks can't afford their own slaves. And a lot of them don't want to pay a white man to do a job that a slave can do for cheaper. So he gets cheap labor, but he also gets something else that's interesting, and that is he gets status over black folk. If you can, I might not, if I'm a white man, I might not have enough money to buy a slave, but because I am white, I will never be a slave, right? And at the same time, I can hire a slave to do work for me. Automatically, that puts me above this person within this social hierarchy as it exists at the time. So the slave owner gets something, the rentor gets something, and the slave gets something out of this that he ordinarily would not have. Of course, I'm sure freedom would be better, but he does get some money, right? So he gets a little bit of money, also gets a little bit of independence, right? Because he's out and doing his own thing, and he's working for the guy down the road, and he's coming and going. In fact, a lot of slaves in cities kind of had the run of the streets. Of course, the problem for the slave could be that he gets rented out to a brutal master. Sometimes you don't get a choice. Your owner might just rent you out to the guy down the road, and you don't get a choice. And that guy might be brutal, brutal, brutal. Now, he can't really kill you, right? Because if he does, then he can be sued. He's not going to get in trouble for killing a person. He's going to get in trouble for destroying somebody else's property, as horrible as that sounds, right? So he's not going to kill you. But how well do you think he's going to treat the rented slave? I mean, you might have heard this saying, you never wash a rental car, right? I don't know about that, but I can certainly say this. You will never change the oil on a rental car. You have no reason to treat that thing well. You rent a car and maybe you go out and you hot dog it and you're skidding around or you're speeding or you're revving the engine. It's like, who cares? It's not my car. And so similar circumstances, if you are renting somebody else's property here, a person here, then you don't really have an interest in taking good care of that person. And so sometimes this is a double-edged sword for slaves, this hiring out thing. Now, the hiring out is sometimes also associated with another practice called living out. Many of the slaves who are hired out, they live independently. They might rent a room over the bar or something. And so there is some level of independence here. And again, this happens in cities mostly, or northern areas. It doesn't happen very much in the southern plantations. It does happen somewhat in the Chesapeake, where they have, of course, excuse me. It doesn't happen in the Chesapeake where they have, of course, the tobacco growing, where they're constantly on top of the practice. It doesn't really happen too much in the rice growing regions, although they have the task system, because eventually what happens is that these practices of hiring out and living out, they actually become frowned upon. And so this stuff, is something that a lot of white folk, even if they don't own slaves or have an interest, at least financially, in slavery, they're not going to like, because they believe slaves have too much freedom. They believe slaves get too uppity, you see. And so a lot of people in a lot of white folk think, you know what, this is not a good idea. And as slavery gets tightened more and more down the road, of course, a lot of this hiring out and living out stuff gets eliminated. But the people, again, who are doing this, who are being hired out and who are living out, they tend to be more anglicized, meaning more Englishified, right? To put it badly, they're anglicized, and because they're less likely to be amongst other slaves. And if they are amongst other slaves, these are also largely going to be anglicized. As we noted, African culture and the growth of an African American culture is going to be strongest in the Deep South. where we have huge plantations, right? Large plantations. Oh, by the way, so I kind of wanted to say a couple of things here. I mean, look at these advertisements. So we know that this hiring out happened quite a bit. And that bottom one, the general agent and collector, they were even brokers who would deal in getting people together, meaning I can get you a hired slave from the guy who owns a slave down the road, right? And so you pay me a commission, kind of like a finder's fee. So this was all about business for a lot of these people. So as I was saying, back to the point of the plantation, large plantations, which, would, again, the Carolinas and Georgia, where in fact slaves are going to be more African and are going to, in fact, have a more traditional sort. They're going to be not so English. Let me put it that way. On these plantations, slaves, though, will fashion their own lives according to old customs. And it's going to be a hodgepodge of sorts, an amalgam. What do I mean by that? Well, here's the thing. Africa is an invention. The term Africa was something, I mean, these people did not consider themselves Africans. These are people who came from various tribes and who had different lineages and who spoke different languages. And from the European point of view, all these people look alike. That's how they see them. Okay. All these people seem to be alike in terms of their dress and all that, right? So, in fact, from the European point of view, these are all Africans. But these people didn't think of themselves as that. But what they, of course, recognize very quickly is that they are not only are they seen this way by the Europeans, but they are in fact sharing an experience of slavery. They are all cast into the same mold. They are all they're all in chain, and they're all treated horribly. And so eventually what happens is that they recognize that amongst themselves, they have a lot in common. And so what happens eventually is that slaves, and especially on plantation, will actually engage in cultural formation, which exists largely as a form of resistance to slavery. Now, it's not to say that they recognize this as such, but it happened. And we're going to flesh this out a little bit more as to what I mean by that. But let's look at some examples of how slaves are fashioning their lives according to old customs and sometimes blending them with new stuff. One of the things that they do is establish kinship ties. Kinship. And we're talking about relationships, brother, sister, right? Family, relatives. Now, these are people who have no blood ties to each other because you remember, I mean, if you've made it this far to a southern plantation, then who didn't make it? All kinds of people didn't make it. They didn't make it all the way to the Barracoon on the coast, right? They didn't make it through Africa. They didn't make it over the Middle Passage. And so by the time they get to maybe the Caribbean or to the Carolinas or Georgia, they've already established kinship ties with the people that are their fellow travelers of sorts. And we see that according to the accounts of the Middle Passage, on board these ships, slaves are already calling each other brother and sister. So this is interesting, right? And I don't know. And of course, that whole thing is still this calling each other brother and sister. You see it, of course, in church, but among the Black community, there's a particularly strong sort of cultural element of the use of terms like brother, sister. Of course, it's brother, right, and sister, right. But I have to wonder. I've never personally researched this, but my sense is that the use of that term, even in modern day language, what's up, brother? What's up, sister? It may be tied also to the slave experience where they are forming new families on board ships, forming new families when a new slave comes to the plantation. When a new slave is brought into the plantation, whether that slave comes from the plantation down the road or from the Caribbean or fresh off the boat from Africa, they are going to automatically, within the slave community, be placed within some family or another. You didn't have anybody, you arrive at this plantation, you're the new guy, but before you know it, you got a brother, you got a sister, you have a grandmother. And so they have these sorts of adoptions into the family for these new arrivals. And you have to remember, these people had been torn from their families. They had been taken from everything that they knew and thrust into these circumstances and forced to survive. So this is a way of asserting their humanity by forming families and kinship ties, keeping some form of structure around themselves is crucial. So not only did they engage culturally in forming culture through kinship ties, they also, of course, used music and singing. Now, some of these things are not written on the slides, but they, of course, are fair game. The reason I write some things on the slides is to make sure that people, if the word isn't clear or the spelling isn't clear, there it is. So you have slaves who will engage in music and singing. They will sing while they work, and of course, a lot of this singing is about their past, where they came from, their families, their worlds, right? And so it's interesting, this of course, the singing and music is cultural, but it also, and they do it while they work, and so it makes the work go by faster. It's a way to survive the day. But because of this, there grows a myth among the surrounding white community. Oh, look at those slaves. They're out there in the fields. They're singing. They must be happy. So a myth grows about the happy slave here because of this singing and music, the singing and the music playing. But of course, that's a form of entertainment, a way to survive, a way to connect with people next to you. So you're not just sitting there all day long working. You're going to be doing some talking, but the singing and the coming together across cultural lines to form new sorts of music and songs, that's going to be crucial to their survival as a people and to their identity. Now, another form of cultural resistance, so to speak, comes in the form of housing. Now, these slaves, often on the plantations, they're left alone to live in slave quarters. And largely speaking, masters don't have much business there. It's not to say that the masters won't go there, right? But this is the slave community. It is unto itself. It is theirs. It gives them a sense of self and a form of identity. Right? That is their kingdom, so to speak. You can see here in the pictures what that might have looked like. And you're going to see in the early decades, and this is going to change over time, but the buildings, the interior decor, all of that is going to be based on African traditions. Of course, it will be mixed with European traditions as well. So you're going to see, these people able to form some sort of cultural space, I suppose, away from the master's prying eyes, where within these communities, everybody has his or her own place in terms of the social hierarchy. Even though the slave owner may see all these people as the same and on the same level, within that community, they recognize levels of importance. The elderly, of course, have a great importance amongst these people. Another form of cultural sort of survival is cuisine, food. And a lot of it, of course, is African. Later on, it will blend with all the New World animals. We're going to see that down the road, where you're going to have, of course, the growth of what they call soul food. We'll talk about that later. Another way, think about this. Everybody dresses a certain way, and people believe that the way you dress, most people do, right? The way you dress says something about who you are. Like me, I never wear anything like that has a logo. I don't wear Nike stuff. I wear Nike shoes because, what else are you going to do, right? But, I don't like to wear Nike shirts or Nike hats and all that kind of stuff. I just don't feel like I want to be an advertisement board for those companies. But other people love that stuff, right? And so they believe it sends a message. So the way they dress also based on African tradition and tribal roots. But it's not just the way they dress, it's also what they have on their bodies. Africans, among other peoples, had for a very long time this tradition of scarification, where they would scar their skin on their body to indicate, it's almost like a tattoo. Again, tattoos mean something, right? It took me a long time to figure out what I wanted for tattoos. Once I started, I just didn't want to start. My brother is a tattoo artist. He owned his own shop for a while, but he's still doing tattooing, and he did all my stuff for free. Point is, what you put on your body signifies something to people. And so, much in the same way, when they scarred people's bodies, their skin, these were called, by the way, country marks, they indicated things about that person. Tribal affiliation. Who are your people, right? Even the status within the tribe of those people and identity. And all of this is going to be recognized within the slave community. Now, again, the slave master may look at this and be like, whatever, man. But amongst the slave community, they recognize people according to tribal affiliation and identity, and even according to status. So all of these show a very complex sort of slave culture amongst these people. And in fact, it's not something that had been talked about for a very, very long time. For a long time, historians said, oh, blacks don't really have, or the slaves did not really have, their own culture. Well, they did. It was just a mixture of things, and it wasn't considered important enough, I suppose, for too long to talk about. But I find this fascinating. Another form of cultural survival is language, the use of language. And what we see is in these places something called Creole being developed. Creole. So Creole, it basically means like a mixture, but when we think of Creole, we often think of language. In fact, amongst these slaves in these areas where there were a lot of them on plantations, you would see people engaging in language that actually mingled various West African languages. Think about it, right? So you're from one tribe, I'm from another. We just got thrown together. I don't really know how to talk to you, but I will use some of my words and some of your words, and I'm going to it's going to move back and forth. We're going to learn from each other. Well, all of this happens. Of course, you throw more tribes in there, but then you throw in English, and then you have some slaves that are coming from the Spanish or the French Caribbean thrown in there, and this is what's called creolization. It is a blending of languages, a blending of culture. A prime example of this are these languages called Gullah and Geechee. These are slave languages that was spoken, and there's still speakers of it today here and there, or at least people who are heavily influenced by it. And these are languages that emerged in South Carolina and Georgia, particularly along the coast of South Carolina and Georgia, on the islands off of South Carolina and Georgia where slaves were kept. So what's interesting about this whole Creole thing for me, amongst all these things I talked about, but is also this, and that is that, and we have to be careful when we talk about generalizations, but we can, I think, identify a Black vernacular, a certain way of speaking, right? And so what a lot of people recognize or don't recognize is that Black vernacular today, such as it is in fact steeped in this past. I'll give you an example. I grew up in Cleveland, Ohio, as I've noted before, and I went to a school that was like 70, 80% Black. And we were all pretty well poor. So we're not talking about middle class or rich folk here. Well, my Black friends would, they wouldn't say things like, I'm going to go home, or even I'm going to go home. They say, I'm finna go home, right? Or they would say, he be tripping, she be tripping, right? And so this is what, in the 90s, they were calling this Ebonics. Today, they call it something else, Black vernacular or African-American vernacular, something, right? But the point is that a lot of people look down on this language today without recognizing, in fact, that it is a direct descendant of this creolization process that existed during slave period, and of course, which continued through until today. And so it's important when we look at people and their cultural characteristics and how they are situated and so forth, and when we think about them, and if we're going to make judgments about them, or even if we're not, we should recognize, in fact, why these things exist. Language is a really good sort of example of that, of how we need to be careful. Of course, religion is something that surrounds these people's lives. In the African tradition, there was a long-standing sort of long-standing sort of practice or belief in magic. So you would have medicine men, and these are and sometimes women, but mostly men. These are men who would use, you know, herbs and medicines to create potions or salves or teas that could cure. And in fact, it's interesting because these were sometimes used by white folk. You know, you might have the white mistress of the plantation, the owner's wife, who isn't really being helped by the local English doctor, and you know, the master calls for, you know, the guy from the slave quarters who, you know, who may be able to cure her with some sort of tea or potion or poultice or salve or whatever it is. And so they use this. You know, and what's interesting also is that along with this, though, came this idea called conjuring, to conjure, to bring up. It was thought among black folk, among these slaves, that certain people had the power to conjure up things. They could create curses. They could put curses on you, or they could actually put blessings on you, a benediction of sorts, right? Of course, everybody wants the blessing, and so that is, if the community truly believes that this is a person who can put a curse on you, or this is a person who can put a blessing on you, that person is going to have, in fact, a lot of status within that community. What's interesting is that, you know, they believed it to be true. What's more interesting, though, is that even white folk bought into this. You have to remember that, you know, these were people who came from England, and England has a long history of ideas of witches and witchcraft. I mean, you guys know, right? You know, Salem witch trials and all that. But so they feared these people. In fact, some men who were known as conjurers on plantations were given special favors by the white owners, because these white owners didn't want to be cursed. They would prefer to be blessed. Now, of course, this is all part of the negotiation, in a sense, between slaves and slave owners, but it can only be taken so far. Not every slave owner is going to believe in this stuff. But they did. These people amongst in the slave quarters, they had this idea of a spirit world. And the spirit world was very often, well, sometimes like Christianity, where they believed in ghosts and they believed in God. And of course, they had holidays to celebrate all this stuff. Now, some of their traditions, these slaves' traditions, were very much like Christianity. Sometimes they were very much like the old African religions, with the bongo drums and, of course, the use of benediction and curse and all that kind of stuff. What's interesting is that over time, these ideas blended within the slave quarters and within the slave community. This is called syncretism, specifically religious syncretism, where, in fact, religions blend with each other. Not because you intend to, but just because it happens. Now, I'll be straightforward with you. I don't know of any pure religion historically. Maybe you can, you know, maybe you disagree. But even Christianity has a lot of syncretism in it. Think about the Puritans. The Puritans did not like, they were Christian, but the Puritans did not like Christmas. They believed anybody who celebrated Christmas was a heretic, was going to hell, quite frankly. Why? Because it involved pagan rituals. It involved non-Christian rituals, like a Christmas tree. A Christmas tree comes from the use of a Christmas tree, comes from the pagan rituals, comes from this Saturnalia sort of worship or celebration. We don't need to go too deeply into that. This is just kind of an example of syncretism, right, and what it means, and the fact that it happens throughout history to all religions, and that is, Christmas itself, right? The Christmas tree inside. There was a tradition amongst old German pagans that, right around the time of December, they would burn a tree or burn what they call the Yule log. And today, of course, that by now it's been sort of transmorphed into a Christmas tree, and you still burn it because you put little lights on it, right? And of course, any historian who will talk about Jesus and when he existed will tell you that he was born sometime in April, sometime in the spring, not December 25th. December 25th happened to be an old pagan holiday onto which Christianity was sort of glommed on top of. Anyway, we're sort of getting off point here, right? The point is that these slaves, with their spirit world, blended elements of Christianity and African religions, various African religions. And this is gonna happen more and more. For a very long time, they only kind of stuck to themselves because, in fact, a lot of slave owners did not want to teach them religion. But that's going to change in the early 1700s. It will change dramatically. So by the 1750, it's in place, but we haven't quite talked about that yet. Okay, moving on to cultural characteristics, cultural survival. They would have rites of passage. Every society has a rite of passage, whether it's graduation, whether it's a sweet 16 or a quinceañera, whether it's any form of ceremony that marks a stage of your life, right? And so these are rites of passage. Even things like births, marriage, death. I'll give you an example. So among these people, they would have naming ceremonies, and it was the African tradition to, in fact, when you name the child, to hold the child up to the skies, name the child. Now, you may recognize this. It looks, that scene from The Lion King, right? I think everybody's watched The Lion King, but they did that in The Lion King. And so there is some truth to this. They would name them, first of all, when I say first of all, I mean in the early years. Later on, late 1800s and all that, it's going to change. But they would name them in the early years after ancestors, after the old traditional names. But eventually, that's going to be lost because they're going to lose more and more ties to Africa. The more and more they reproduce here, the fewer and fewer people are coming over to refresh their memories of things. What's interesting is that for a long time, and even later on, they would often refuse to be named a slave name. You may have heard people say, "I don't go by that name. That's my slave name," right? And that's back in the day, they would actually go by two different names. You may have seen the movie Roots, right? Fantastic movie, very, very, very emotional, beautiful in many ways, but also very troubling, of course. But in this movie, you will see LeVar Burton. You may know LeVar Burton from the Star Trek series and then that reading channel or something. Anyway, whatever. LeVar Burton, he plays a slave named Kunta Kinte. And it's been years since I saw this, but I still remember it when I was watching it when I was a kid. And the slave master wants him to change his name to Toby. And so they string him up and they bear his back and they just continue whipping him and saying Toby, and he keeps saying Kunta Kinte, and they're like, bah, Toby. And they would beat this into them. And so what they're trying to do, of course, and by doing this, is strip you from your identity. You're not a person, you're a slave. You are what I tell you to be. I can name you. What's interesting is that although this happens, they go by the name Toby, perhaps, amongst the outside community. They answer to Toby when they're called by the slave driver or the overseer, but within their own house, they will still go by their own names. And in fact, mothers would name their children a certain something, and everybody would call that child that. because it is a form of control of the child. It is a form of identity. You can only control so much in this life. And you recognize that your son, your daughter, whoever it is, has to live two lives. In here, my son is known as Kunta. Out there, he's known as Toby. And growing up in Cleveland, I had friends who refused to use what they call their government. That's my government name. That's my government name, right? John. His kid's name was Jonathan Walker or whatever it was, and he's like, no, my name. I go by Peanut, right? Peanut. I had a friend named Peanut. Several friends named stuff like that. And they just like, no, this is my government name. I'm not going to go by that. I will answer to that in school, but out here I'm something else. So, I notice here the band over the man's chest. That's still, orange and black, still very much in keeping with the African sort of motif. They would also have marriage ceremonies. And historically, now you should know that in most places, in many places, they're not recognized by law, right? At least in the South, they're not recognized by law. And so, but again, they are recognized within the slave community. And sometimes, even though they're not recognized by law, they are recognized by the slave owner. So a slave owner would recognize the fact that these people are married. Others within the slave community would recognize that these people are married. Within the slave community, it does mean something. Outside the slave community, the master may recognize it in order to benefit himself. So he knows that he can use this relationship to his advantage, perhaps. You better behave or I will sell your wife down the road, down the river, literally down the river. Or you better behave because I do it to your husband. You get the point. Also, they would use it as a form of punishment. You know that in some instances, slave owners would tie a slave woman down and tie the man down near her so he can watch while the slave owner has his way with her. This, of course, is a form of punishment. It is a form of punishment based on these people's cultural identities, right? How they are, how their formation of family is being used against them. And it's brutal stuff, right? And we're going to come back to some of these things. Right now, I want to continue talking about the rites of passage. By the way, the marriages, they're in the slave quarters used an old tradition that was even used among poor white folk, but really became like a black sort of tradition among the slaves, is to jump the broom. They call it jumping the broom. You hold hands, and I'm pretty sure they did this in Roots. You hold hands, and if you jump the broom together, that is the ceremony. Everybody recognizes it. Another rite of passage, of course, is death. And these would be raucous affairs, celebrations with singing and dancing, because it was not a somber affair. They saw it as the person moving on, the person going on to a better life than the one they have there. And so we have this distinct black culture forming in the South. And a lot of it, because slaves are moved around here and there, this will, of course, move throughout the colonies. But it's very, very strong in the plantations where it's formed largely. Now, these people are going to experience a blending of cultures, right? So you have the various African tribes. You have Caribbean slaves that were either brought from, by the French, Spanish. They might speak Dutch. You have the colonial born who are different across the colonies. You have free black folk mostly in the North. All of this informing what is becoming understood and which we should understand today as an African American sort of culture. These people are not fully African, and they're not fully American. They kind of have a foot in both worlds, wondering where they really belong. And all of it comes from all this blending, and of course this idea, not the idea, because I'm not saying that they actually took this upon themselves to do, but what I think happened, of course, is that they somehow on some level recognize this as a form of asserting humanity. And this blending, of course, within, and among slaves will, of course, occur also with white culture. We already know that in the North, they're very, very English. And in the North, you're going to see their holidays and celebrations and traditions blend. An example of this is something called Negro Election Day. I'm going to come back to this, but I will tell you that this happens in New England, where things are a little bit freer for some folk. But this is a blending of cultures between white people and black people. In the Chesapeake, where you see a lot of Scots Irish come through and settle, these, by the way, the Scots Irish are the white Southerners today. They're descended from the Scotch Irish. Well, guess what? It's the Scotch Irish that were the ones that brought over the language he be, she be, we be. He be tripping, she be tripping, we be partying, right? Um, it was the Scots Irish, and it was the Scots Irish who were tended to be the poor folk who would more likely rub elbows, so to speak, with the African slaves. The master, the main guy, he's not really doing this. The main guy would hire Scots Irishmen as overseers of the plantation, and of course, by doing that, he is creating between himself and the Scotch Irishmen a bond of whiteness. This guy's poor, and he may, in fact, be. I mean, the Scots Irish were treated horribly, and so they may have something in common with the people who are enslaved, but they're not going to be allowed to see that. They're going to, the master will use the situation to better his own situation, right? So he will, by placing the Scots Irishman in the position of overseer, will bring him closer to himself and separate him farther and further away from other poor people who are enslaved. Now, interestingly enough, the Scots Irish also pick up African ways of talking. And so you still see this I understand, in some places in the South. What's interesting is that the Scots Irish actually, and the Southern descendants today, are very fond of something called the banjo. You guys know what a banjo is. It's like a guitar with lots of strings. It's roundish at one end, right? It's got the round body, and this banjo is loved today in the South. You see that in all kinds of Southern music. But guess what? That was an African instrument. And so the Scots Irish pick up culture also from the slaves. And so this cultural blending, this creolization, I suppose, happens across the colonies, but not as much in places like Carolina and Georgia. You still see that happening there, but it's not as prevalent as it is in places like the Chesapeake or in the North. This creolization. But again, this process of cultural blending in the New World, we're not talking about just mixing of individuals, their bloodlines. We're talking about the mixing and forming new culture. And that is why today we use this term African American. A lot of people have trouble with this term. They believe it's just politically correct. But in using it, we should recognize, I think, that there's a strong African cultural influence that exists today that comes down to us from this period of time during the years of slavery. A lot of it remains today. It's in the music, it's in the language, and it's a blend of both worlds. And so this construction of family and culture is going to be a form of resistance. It's not conscious, right? But it is revolutionary. Because these people are revolutions are about freedoms, and these people can only have so much freedom, but they cobble together what they can under the worst circumstances. They have a form of agency. They are agents in a sense of their own futures. None of us, I think, can wholly dictate our future. I mean, what if we could, right? None of us can wholly dictate our future, but all of us can make decisions within the circumstances that we find ourselves. Slaves are revolutionary in this way. Probably the most common form of conscious resistance involved running away. So this happened quite a bit. Very often, more often than not, this was temporary. So we have a couple of terms that differentiate sort of a temporary departure with intent to return from uh, what you hope to be a real departure with no intent to return. So the first one is truant. So here's where a slave runs away and decides, hey, I'm going to run away, but I'm coming back. I have this intent to return. Sometimes it would be hours, sometimes days, sometimes weeks, but there's always a sense that they're coming back. In fact, more often than not, they do this, they run away to another plantation to see loved ones, especially for important events. You might be married to someone who actually is enslaved by someone down the road. It could be miles away. Or your son or your daughter or your mother was sold off, and you're going to go see that person. So truancy, right? Sort of being absent without a leave, um, but still with the intent to return. And very often it would be also for birthdays and weddings and funerals, you see. And slave owners understood this. They knew this. Of course, they would still, of course, have to deliver some form of punishment because they can't, within their system, as they see it, allow this to happen. Now, compared to truancy is a form of running away called lying out. And this, again, there's no real intent to return. Very often, those who are lying out are hiding out in swamps or woods, if only temporarily, looking for ways to keep moving away. Very often, they're hiding out in swamps or woods, and they're helped by fellow slaves, sometimes even helped by Native Americans who take them in even. Sometimes Native peoples, they send them back because they don't want any more problems with white settlers. So sometimes they're out there hiding in swamps or woods and looking for ways to keep moving. Other times they're out there hiding in the swamps or the woods and creating maroon communities, as we've noted before. These are slave communities that sometimes last for weeks or months and months. And sometimes these maroon communities of slaves are living just on the frontier away from white communities. Sometimes, as I said, they blend with native tribes. Sometimes they negotiate with white folk on the terms of returning. Doesn't happen often, but if all of your quote unquote workers run off, you might just have to give up a little something, right? So it's not something that we normally think of when we think about slaves, but they had some sort of power in numbers. And we know that a lot of these people ran away because there's all kinds of different slave advertisements. This might be a little bit difficult to see, but one thing I'm pretty sure you can see is that there's a great price differential for different kinds of people, depending on who the slave is and what the slave can do. Again, they're looking at this in very stark economic terms. How valuable a property are you? The more valuable you are, the more likely I will, of course, give a large reward. The least valuable or the less valuable you are, then the lesser the reward. And so if you look at these ads, I think you can make some of it out, but you can actually kind of get a feel for who these people were, what they were like, what kinds of lives they lived. And there's, of course, the exercise on Canvas that I hope you will complete. And so, tell me, what can we glean? What information can we glean from these people's lives? And can we trust these ads? Can we trust them? Do we trust the information that's in them? Why or why not? So take a look at those. So another facet or another sort of practice that is unfortunately tied to running away was the advent of slave patrols. So you would sometimes have patrols of white men, poor or ordinary white men, who would get together and patrol the town streets or the outlying areas. or go out there to, in fact, catch a runaway slave. You have to understand, these poor white men, they don't own, most white people did not own slaves back in the day. But that does not mean that poor, ordinary white people did not have an interest in keeping slaves in their place. I mean, once they're there, you literally, if you are a poor white man, are going to be living in a place where you have to fear slave uprisings. So they're literally afraid of them. So they have a literal interest in keeping slaves in their place, but they also have a figurative interest in keeping slaves in place. As a poor white man, you will never be a slave. You may be poor, you may be white with no shoes, but you're never going to be that guy. He's enslaved, he's in chains. So there's always going to be somebody beneath you. So this is, we're kind of getting into sort of esoteric territory, right? Kind of, abstract ways of thinking about this. But it's interesting, right? Because a lot of people will say, well, most white people did not own slaves back in the day, and therefore you cannot sort of paint them all with the same brush. And there's something to that. But white people generally, as a whole, even poor white ordinary folk, had an interest in keeping slaves in their place. One, out of fear. Two, because of the social hierarchy. So long as there's somebody beneath me, I'm not at the bottom. But also, there was a lot of poor white people who believed, and they believed this was already kind of becoming the land of opportunity. One of those opportunities would perhaps be owning a slave of your own down the road. And so they're not going to overturn a system that can benefit them. You might just own a slave down the road, and you don't want slaves freed, because if slaves are freed, then what's going to happen next? They're going to be living black people are going to be living next door to you, and these people do not want that. And if slaves are freed, they might just be equal, and these people do not want that, right? To be put on the same level as black folk. And so they have this literal and figurative, this very abstract sort of interest in keeping slaves in place. And, the slave patrols were common because rebellion is not uncommon. A lot of white folk fear rebellion. And by the way, black people do too. A lot of slaves fear rebellion. And we're going to talk more about this shortly, but I mean, think about it. Whenever a rebellion jumps off, even if you're a slave, but you're not part of it, well, you're also going to be a target, because somebody else started it, and the white population is going to come together and just try to clamp it all down. And the reality is that violent rebellion doesn't happen every day, but it's not rare, it's not uncommon, and they happen everywhere that slaves are being held. They happen on slave ships, in the middle of the Atlantic. And they happen throughout the Atlantic region. They happen anywhere slaves are taken: the Caribbean, South America, Mexico, and of course all the English colonies. Because no matter where you are, if you hold people in human bondage, they will fight back. And so English colonists live in fear. And depending on where you are, you might have more fears of one thing than another. For example, in the North, there are fewer rebellions in the North, although they do happen. Most likely in the North, you're going to have very few slaves who know each other. Sometimes, like in New England, for example, if you're a slave, you might be the only slave within 15 miles, because there's no plantations up there. So fewer rebellions occur in the North, although they do happen. In the North, more likely than not, you're going to be, if you are a slave, engaging in some sort of domestic tasks, very often living in the same house with the people who own you. You're doing the cooking, right? And so that can be scary. If you are a slave owner, if you are a slave owner, then you realize that a domestic servant who is serving you your meals is someone who, if pushed too far, may just decide to put something in your food that doesn't belong. Right? I mean, have you ever seen the movie The Help, right? Turd pie. And it just doesn't have to be something disgusting. It could actually be poison. The point is that human beings can be pushed only so far, and they will fight back. And if you have these people living in your house, you cannot treat them too badly. It's not to say that you treat them well, but there's always this negotiation back and forth, right? It's always on your mind about how close you can get. You still have to maintain control as you see it, but you can't, quote unquote, overdo it. I mean, these people are cooking for you. Some of these slaves in the domestic household will sleep just outside the master's door, just in case the master needs something, a drink of water at night, or the chamber pot. You probably know what a chamber pot is, right? They didn't have toilets back then. The slave would bring in this big old pot, and the master, the wife or whatever, would go potty in it and then give it to the slave to go and take care of. So these people are sleeping just outside the door, sometimes at the foot of the bed. I mean, this is weird stuff. I mean, it reminds me of people sleeping with dogs at the foot of their bed. It's really disturbing stuff. But the point again that I'm trying to bring home here is that colonists live in fear. No matter that what they're doing, they're living in fear. And in the North, as I said, not a whole lot of rebellions, but they do happen. I'll give you an example. One happens in 1712 in New York City. Now, New York City in some early 1700s is a densely populated place. A lot of Black folk living here, free as well as enslaved. In fact, the slaves here, because it's a very urban area, they have the run of the streets. They're not shackled down. They're walking around town, and people basically know whose slave is whose. They're working side by side with whites, interestingly enough, right? But they're still slaves. And so in 1712, about a dozen or so slaves armed themselves. They set fire to a building, and when the white men come to try to put it out, they kill like 9 of these people. So this is a real slave rebellion. It's violent. Now, the militia comes in and it crushes the rebellion, and they hold public executions of most of the rebels. And by the way, if you've ever been to New York City, the public executions were held right in what is today Chinatown, right around Canal Street there. Most of these people are hanged. Several of these men are burned alive because of the fear that this sort of violence can happen at any moment. And white folk know this. And therefore, they have to try to come full force whenever a rebellion does happen. They burn some of these guys alive. Some of them commit suicide before they even allow themselves to be executed because they know how bad it's going to be. After this New York City rebellion in New York, slave codes are tightened. Laws restricting free Black people's movements are tightened. So anytime there's a rebellion, slave codes get tightened, right? These are the codes that, as we've talked about before, that regulate slaves, the lives of slaves, their movements, what they can do, what they can't do. But there are also laws restricting the lives and free movement of Black people who are free. So the entire Black population gets it. Whenever there's a slave rebellion, everybody who's Black is going to get the bad end of the stick, if you know what I mean. So that's the North, where slave rebellions happen. But in the South, there's a constant fear because there are so many slaves. Again, they outnumber white folk in South Carolina, in Georgia. And rebellions down there, they can be big and they can be bloody. One of the most famous of the time, perhaps I think the most famous of the time, happens in South Carolina in 1739. The Stono Rebellion. Now, this happens with what happens, I should say, is that slaves in South Carolina are actually, a lot of them are Catholics who are living under English rule in South Carolina. These are slaves, Catholic slaves, who had been brought from like the French Caribbean. They had been, converted to Catholicism by the French. By the way, the French were always about converting people, much like the Spanish, not so much the English. And so these slaves were Catholic slaves, and they knew that they were under the control of Protestant English folk. They also know that hundreds of miles south of the Carolinas was Spanish-controlled Catholic territory. Catholic Spain controls Florida. So in South Carolina, and by the way, in between South Carolina and Florida is of course the area of Georgia, but that's just kind of getting off the ground. It's still very sparsely populated. Georgia was, I think, established in like 1732 or something like that, a few years before the Stoner Rebellion. Point is, these slaves actually want to go to Florida. They know something. In 1693, the Spanish had already declared that any runaway slave that comes to them and converts to Catholicism will be freed. And so in Florida, you have, in fact, a lot of Black folk who are living under the Spanish flag, and they're living as Spaniards. Now, we're not saying they're seen as equal, but they're seen as spiritual equals with regard to Catholicism, and they are not enslaved. Many Black people who actually, there's a lot of Black people who try to run away from the English colonies and go to Florida. There are, in fact, so there's going to be some free Black people there, right, in northern Florida. And they're going to, actually, the Spanish, going to bring a lot of freed Black people here to Florida. So the point is, you have this sort of safe place for slaves. If they can make it from South Carolina to Florida, they're already Catholic. They want to be under Catholic rule. They believe that's important. And they want to be free. So, happens the rebellion. And by the way, you might think, well, how is it that slaves in South Carolina know what's going on in Florida? I mean, they had no internet. But slaves are not stupid. They have their own sort of grapevines of gossip. We have to remember that a lot of slaves are being traded around. And so they're not dumb. These are human beings. They're bright people. They're just enslaved. And so they have this network of gossip and information that spreads throughout the region. And so they know that this is actually a thing, so to speak. Florida, you can be free. So what happens, of course, is that several dozen slaves in South Carolina, they steal some weapons and they start setting fire to buildings. And they're heading south. They're heading toward the town of St. Augustine. St. Augustine, by the way, first permanent city, and well, it's the oldest city in what is today the United States, right? It was Spanish. They head south toward St. Augustine, Florida. It's still there, by the way, St. Augustine. And they're killing all kinds of white folk as they leave. And as they're heading out, they're recruiting dozens more slaves, and they're shouting all kinds of things about liberty. Well, the voluntary militia comes and crushes this rebellion. They just crush them. They kill dozens and dozens of slaves. Even slaves who surrender are put to the blade. They have their heads cut off. These slaves are decapitated and have their heads put on pikes, like as mile markers on the way back to town. It's really Game of Thrones kind of thing here, right? They stick them in prominent places in town, the heads of slaves. They're sending a message. If you're a slave, you don't do this. They're also sending a message to white folk. This is what we do with these people. And of course, they wouldn't see them as people, at least not admitted. So with regard to the Stoner Rebellion, and with regard to everything that I've been talking about, is that, with regard to significance, I should say, is that the slaves exercise agency in many ways, but also through violence. They exercise it by fighting for others. A lot of Black people who live on the frontiers of the English territories, of the frontier Yeah, well, let me back up. Black people live on the frontier between English and European territories. They will often run away to join those European powers, and then actually join the fight against their former masters, right? The English, right? They will join, for example, the French. They will join the Spanish, and then they will actually join their militaries and fight back against the English. Fight back also against native peoples. These people are exercising agency by fighting, by running away, creating maroon communities, all these things that we talked about. They're rebelling. And they take immense risks to do this. In fact, interestingly enough, some of the slaves from the Stoner Rebellion actually make it to Florida. The chances of you getting caught, I mean, the repercussions are horrifying. But what would make somebody take the chance? How bad is slavery? If, in fact, you know that if you are caught, and you're likely to be caught because you know, you're outnumbered largely in terms, well, you're outgunned, right? Largely in these places. And you're more than likely going to fail. But some actually make it. And that's enough to keep some people going. But there's always going to be these repercussions after rebellions. The Stoner Rebellion is famous for its repercussions. Slave codes are tightened dramatically. They have all kinds of new punishments that are made up. They invent and start using new sorts of contraptions and shackles to prevent people from walking or even prevent people from sleeping. I mean, look at these contraptions here. Look at this. Imagine trying to sleep in that thing. That thing around, those spikes and things coming off your neck, or they put a helmet on you, and the idea is to make your life miserable. That's how they control, and so slaves, obviously they can't get freedom as easily as before under the system. Before the Stoner Rebellion, there were laws that were let me rephrase. After the Stoner Rebellion, there are going to be a lot of laws that are put in place in South Carolina to discourage manumission by the owner. Remember, manumission means the freeing of a slave, sometimes by purchase, self-purchase. You get the point, or just a slave owner who decides he's going to be a good guy for once and he'll free you. So there's going to be laws in South Carolina that discourage manumission by the owner. So if you're a slave owner in South Carolina, you are going to be not prohibited, but you're going to be discouraged from freeing your slaves. They discourage you by placing a tax. If you sell your slave, they're going to place a tax on you, and it's going to be high. So you're not going to have a great incentive to to free the slave. If you free the slave, then you're going to be taxed. So you're much more likely to, if you don't want to have a slave anymore, is to, in fact, sell that slave out of the colony. So the law discourages the freeing through taxation. Slaves cannot be easily freed. Slaves in South Carolina can't travel without a written pass from the owner after Stono. White people, like in Virginia, can police slaves. There are slave patrols that crop up. And by the way, there's a lot of talk about how slave patrols became the police and all that. That's overblown. I don't subscribe to that view. But if what we're looking at is sort of, and law enforcement as we see it, yes, law enforcement used to be very much a volunteer thing. So the slave patrols, of course, were largely volunteer. Sometimes they would get a little money here and there, but largely volunteer. As I said before, poor white men had an interest in keeping slaves in their place. But you can't really draw a straight line from slave patrols to police today. Not really. So slave patrols exist, and they're allowed to kill any rebellious black person with no trial. Boom. Slave patrols in South Carolina can stop any black person to ask them a question about where they are, who they are, where they belong. If a slave doesn't have a pass, then that person can that white person can actually, it doesn't even have to be someone who's a member of a slave patrol, but that white person can actually just whip that slave. And if they resist, they have the right to kill that person, the slave. So white people are going to be policing slaves. They're going to be in the slave patrols. They're going to be allowed to stop and question any black person. They're going to be allowed to whip a black person, a slave who has no pass. They're going to be able to kill a slave who resists. Another thing that they do in order, and notice, the slave owners are using poor white people to do their bidding. Well, the slave owners are also going to recruit native peoples to do their bidding. They will form treaties or agreements with neighboring tribes to return runaways. And if you return runaways, you get an exchange of some European goods. It might give you some guns or something, right? So notice there, again, there's this divide and conquer sort of practice. And so, point is, they're living in fear. White folk are living in fear even as they hold countless human beings in bondage. So, and they're enforced every time something like this happens, like the Stoner Rebellion. The English colonies will pass laws to restrict black freedoms, freedoms of slaves and freedoms of free black people. These laws, after Stono, are spreading more and more throughout the South. And there are going to be laws also that spread throughout the South that deny political rights, right? No jury, no vote, no office holding. There are laws that spread throughout the South that say no interracial fraternization, meaning you can't hang out you can't hang out interracially. You can't live together in the same household if you're black and white. They actually passed laws to punish white women who have sex with black men. And again, if they pass a law to punish this, what does it tell us? It was happening. You don't pass a law unless something's happening already. And you don't like it, you pass a law. So they punish white women who have sex with black men. Of course, it's not the other way around. They're not going to punish white men who have sex with black women. Why not? Well, that's typically the slaveholder who is raping the slave, also creating more property in doing so. So these laws are spreading. No political rights, no interracial hanging out, no fraternization, no carrying of guns. And for a lot of people, right, the idea of a black man in this society, and even I would even venture to say, even a lot of people today say, a black man carrying a gun is a particular threat, is how they would see it. I'm not saying it's right. I'm saying this is how people see things, and it goes back all these centuries. So they're taking rights away, and they're taking guns away. They're saying you cannot own land, and they're doing all of this to restrict again the freedoms of free black folk, in particular, right? You can't get political rights. You cannot hang out with others. You can't carry guns. You can't own land. And the point about this is that free black people are a powerful contradiction, right, to the visions of this slave society. If there are free black people in your society where you are trying to hold this mass of black people in human bondage, then you're going to have a group of people who are your slaves who are in fact going to be encouraged by the fact that they see somebody who looks like them walking around free. So in fact, a lot of these colonies trying to get rid of free black people because from their point of view, black people don't know their proper place. By now, by the 1750s especially, there's this idea that's been solidified that black equals slave. And so colonies across the seaboard are passing these laws. Excuse me. They're passing these laws. And in a sense, this idea or the fact of slavery is going to bind a lot of colonies together. Remember, Georgia was a colony that at first had outlawed slavery, but then had legalized it, and it kind of fell in line. Other colonies who had slaves had complained to Georgia, hey, our slaves are running away to you. Well, now that all the colonies that are going to be the 13 colonies, now that they all have a commitment on some level or another to slavery, they are bound together around that. Something else, in fact, that is going to bind these colonies together in a way that we had not seen before. The colonies, you have to remember, were founded at different times by different people for different reasons. We know that New England was founded, of course, based on this idea of a city upon a hill. New England Puritans and the Pilgrims and the people who came there generally had a religious vision. The people who go to the Chesapeake and down further south, these people are there to make a living. They're there to make money. There's no real religious purpose here. But eventually, religion will bind these colonies. And it is going to be in a movement called the Great Awakening. And at the same time that we're going to see an awakening of religion across the colonies, we're going to see a spiritual and religious awakening among slaves. Let's define the Great Awakening just briefly. It's largely a religious revival. It begins in England, it spreads to the colonies, and it will become the first social movement that crosses all the colonies. Even before the political revolution, even before the colonies got together and started thinking about any sort of government for themselves, right? Which is a long way off. They actually have something in common at the grassroots level, meaning at the bottom, the ordinary folks level, and that is going to be this religious awakening. It's a religious revival, and it's based on the idea that every individual can have a personal and individualized relationship with God, and that all you have to do is give in to Him. People who believed in this at this time, who were pushing this awakening, said, look, people have lost their way. We used to be so religious, but now in these colonies, all we care about is money. We care about things, materialism. Even the Puritans were said to have been actually not as devout as they used to be. Puritans by this time are kind of dying out. They're mixing with others, but the point is that that Puritan ideal has largely been eroded by the early 1700s. And so a lot of people say people have lost their way. You're not going to church anymore. All you care about is yourself. But you must understand that you are God's child, and God is vengeful, and He's disgusted with your human sin. So they say to people, in order to be saved, God will save you, but in order to be saved, you must be born again. Born again means that you have to give yourself up to God. You have to have the spiritual awakening where you recognize your own depravity, right? Your own backwardness. And so you are told, give up your gambling, your drinking, your wife beating. All these things were problems at this time. You must beg forgiveness, give yourself to God, and only He alone can help you. And so this is a very emotional conversion. It's a very personal conversion. And it's grounded in no human authority. It's just you and God. And so what's interesting about this, and here's the kicker, is that it inspires the belief, because you can have a spiritual relationship with God on your own. It inspires the belief that each individual person, even the common person, is worthy of God's inspiration and God's love. So it attracts a lot of different people from all walks of life. Poor white folk across the colonies, even native peoples, and even black peoples, free and enslaved. And so you're going to have a lot of conversions at this time, and even more so 100 years later in the early 1800s. But this whole thing, by the way, jumps off in around the 1730s or 40s. And here's where you see evangelical denominations springing up and spreading. By the way, Baptists and Methodists, these will spread over from England. And so you're going to have all these different, under the spiritual Great Awakening thing, you're going to have all kinds of new church denominations crop up, Lutherans and Baptists and Methodists and, Episcopalian and all these different kinds. And because of that, it's going to make the religion less centralized, and it's going to make it more personal. And it's going to make it seem as though any common man is going to be spiritually equal to any other man. And so they're going to eventually, start talking about spiritual equality, perhaps meaning also social equality, political equality. Now, we can't take this too far, but there are these seeds of change here in the Great Awakening. This idea of being your own person in the eyes of God, and therefore being a spiritual equal to others, is going to lead people to believe that equality can be had in other ways, not just spiritual, but how about here on earth? And in fact, what you're going to see rising at this time is a challenge to slavery. Some preachers will condemn slavery. They'll say spiritual equality means equality for black and white. They start, not everybody takes it that far, but some will say slavery should be abolished. And they say slave revolts are God's punishment on us. But again, not everybody takes it this far. Some might condemn the treatment of slaves. It's like, okay, don't beat them too badly. But here's the point. By and large, you're going to see a spiritual movement against slavery. And in the North, especially in the North, not really in the South, a lot of churches, a lot of Northern churches will accept black people into their congregations. Usually they're not sitting side by side, but they are worshiping in the same church. And sometimes they will even convince, that is, leaders who believe this way will convince some owners to free their slaves because they say it's the Christian thing to do. So notice something. This is happening mostly in the North, right? In the South, slavery is already very, very entrenched. And so it's more likely to happen in the North. And so in the North, you start seeing more movement toward this idea of freeing slaves because it's the Christian thing to do. But again, this is not happening wholesale, but there are rumblings, there's a movement afoot. In fact, most evangelical Christians will accept slavery. And most evangelical leaders, the preachers and such, will tell slaves, this is your lot. Honor your father. So they will teach them things out of the Old Testament. Honor thy father. And who is thy father? Well, your master. Your owner is your father. They will teach them stuff out of the Old Testament like the sons of Ham. Now, according to particular readings of the Old Testament, the sons of Ham are, in fact, black people. And according to the reading of the Old Testament, the sons of Ham are destined by God to forever be servants to others. Something like this. So they use the Old Testament, in fact, as a weapon. And they to keep slaves in place. And in fact, they preach that slavery is compatible with the Bible. Black people, meanwhile, are embracing Christian religion and making it all their own. They're not going to buy into this whole thing. They're seeing things differently. They make it all their own. And they blend this revivalist religion with their own sorts of Africanized and African American, I suppose, by this point, with those ways of worshiping. And these Christian black congregations, these people who are converted, I mean, they have these raucous ceremonies and celebrations in church. Even today, right? There's a difference. I'll tell you something. Black churches are not boring. Right? There's the singing and the clapping and the stomping and the back and forth between the preacher and the people in the pews. Right? They participate. They don't just sit there and listen. Today, African Americans are amongst the most religious people in our country. And interestingly enough, they're also amongst the most hopeful of all groups in the United States. They are the most hopeful. Perhaps it has something to, perhaps it's all relative, right? Meaning, you know, you have a lot of hope because there's still a long way to go. Point is that they embrace this Christian religious fervor. They make it all their own. In fact, black preachers emerge. There are some free black preachers and also some enslaved black preachers who move amongst the people on the plantation. And very often, slaves will secretly preach to each other. They go into the woods, as you see here on the left bottom, right? So an image of that. They go into the woods. Whoops. And they preach amongst themselves in hiding sometimes. And here's where they don't teach honor thy father. Here's where they talk about Moses, right? And they talk about how, you know, the slaves of Egypt, the Jews, were released, how they won their freedom. And of course, this is going to be something that they can embrace. And so slaves are embracing this in their own way. Sometimes, and this happens in the North mostly, they're taught to read the Bible, slaves. For example, Phyllis Wheatley. Phyllis Wheatley was sold into slavery as a little girl, but she comes up amongst a family of Christians. And so she actually, living in the North, is very well spoken in terms of English, right? Because she, as I said before, people in the North tend to be more anglicized. And so she's educated by Christians. She becomes a renowned poet. She's a famous poet. And even at the time, and there's a picture of her there, even at the time, she is a renowned poet in the North. Another one that we can point to is a woman named Lucy Terrence Prince, who was born or lived right around the early 1720s. And she was taken into slavery from Africa as a baby. But she lived as a slave in the 1720s in Massachusetts. Right? She's a slave in New England. Her owner allows for her to be baptized because he buys into this whole Great Awakening thing. At the height of the Great Awakening, she's baptized. She becomes a church member as a very young woman. She's educated according to church teachings, right? Reading, writing, speaking. She marries a free black man, eventually wins her freedom. But what's interesting about her is that she becomes a firebrand orator, speaker in Vermont. This is one of the historical figures in Vermont who stand out as a former slave who becomes a strong orator, and in fact, at one point, goes to court to argue. She was involved in a land dispute with neighbors, and she goes to court, and she ends up arguing in court against a couple of lawyers, and she wins. So she's got this sort of poet, or at least wordsmith thing about her. In fact, she's the first black poet of what will become the United States. She's before Phyllis Wheatley in terms of time. She's not as famous as Phyllis Wheatley because Phyllis Wheatley wrote a lot more stuff. But this woman, right, Lucy Terry Prince, she writes a poem called Bar's Fight. And if you read it, it's just, it's about an attack by Native peoples on a white family. So she takes that sort of perspective and she laments the killing of these people, of the white family. So she's, in a sense, it's interesting because she sees herself almost as part of that white society, even though she's not wholly thereof. But the point about all of this is that Black people are using religion in the 1700s as a form of survival, as a form of identity. They use it to claim for themselves a place within God's universe as they see it, a purpose. And of course, A sense of equality emerges within them. But all of this, of course, frightens a lot of white folk. A lot of white folk try to stop slaves from meeting without white people around, because if there's no white person watching you, who knows what you're up to? A lot of white folk tell their owners, don't teach them religion, don't teach them how to read, because you're getting ideas into their heads. But the black folk are not going to sit idly by. They're going to grab it for themselves. They will forge it for themselves. We're talking free black people and slaves. And this is what makes them revolutionary.